All right, good evening, everyone. We are kicking off our third evening with Artifacts. We're going to let people come into the webinar. So to give folks a couple of minutes to get logged in, a few housekeeping tips before we get started. We've enabled chat. So as we go through tonight's session, if you have questions for Dutch or Ellen or myself, please feel free to pop them into chat. We will take them throughout the evening. If you've got other items, feel free to raise a hand. We are here to take your questions and make it as interactive as possible in a virtual setting. Also want to note that the session is being recorded and we do have a YouTube channel. So you can watch the session or any of the previous sessions if you search for Artifacts on YouTube. And we'll be sending a link to all of our registered attendees after the session. All right. With that, I would like to begin tonight's evening and introduce Dutch Miller. Dutch is joining us tonight. He's had a multi-decade career in estate planning, financial advisement, and also a passionate lover of family history. He's spent time at Glenmead and Northern Trust. He also was an attorney early on in his career. He'll be discussing with us today how to build a memorable and lasting legacy using stories, family histories, memories, and most importantly, all those cherished objects. He'll share with you some of his most favorite family stories and give you some very practical tips for how to get started. So having said that, Dutch, welcome. We're thrilled to have you here this evening.
Thanks so much. I really appreciate this. And as I said, I think I have some kind of initial thoughts, but then I'm hoping that, people will use the chat for questions and comments and suggestions, because I certainly, appreciate hearing good suggestions all the time. So, let's make sure we have a good discussion. So as I was thinking of preparing for this, over the last couple of years, there's been a movement in technology called the Internet of Things. And that's the growing interconnection via the internet of computing devices embedded in sort of everyday life. The theory is the more holistic you can be with data means that you can make better decisions, understand how we interact with technology, and therefore how best to use it. So when you sort of look at that as an analogy, I guess, to estate planning, I think in the past, most estate planning has been solely or almost completely concerned about passing assets. It's not been connected to other parts of our lives or during our life very much. And it's really been just sort of looking at, well, if the IRS doesn't value it, we're going to just ignore it. But I think that we need to start thinking, and I think some estate planning attorneys and others do this, but thinking about interconnected estate planning to make sure it's more holistically connected with our lives, kind of an estate planning of things, coincidentally with artifacts concerned with things. So by considering it interconnected estate planning, we can really make meaning transfers of stories and priorities and beliefs and ethnic heritage and knowledge, and of course, assets. Especially as people are considering downsizing and decluttering, we really need to start thinking about how we plan to transfer our important things to children, family, friends, and others in a way that transfers not just the title and ownership, but also transfers the why, so that people can understand the stories behind the assets. And in some cases, you might choose to make the transfers during life, which does a better chance of assuring the stewardship of the items, as well as you can have the fun of the beneficiary, the person receiving the gift, and being joyfully receiving the gift, and and making sure that they understand the gift. Just a couple of stories, I think, to highlight some of these thoughts, sort of the downsides of not holistically planning. Sometimes it's really important to understand why a gift was made or is being made in order to reduce bad feelings. And there's a story I like to tell. It's not my story. It's a friend of mine who was a trust officer who told a story about he'd been working with a father for many years, and who had a great estate plan and done great things with his assets, and was going to split them evenly to a daughter and a son. And when he did that, he gave all the assets to his son, free from trust, sort of outright. The son could do whatever he wanted with them. But to the daughter, he gave it to the daughter in trust. And after the father died, he didn't explain this, why he was doing this. But after the father died, the daughter found out about this, and she was really hurt because she thought her father didn't have confidence in her, or didn't appreciate her, or wanted to somehow lock up the assets. And in fact, the trust officer knew, and he had to try to explain to the daughter that the reason that the father had done this was that he had so much confidence that she had all the assets she needed. She was living within her lifestyle, within her means. She was being very responsible. She didn't need these assets. And so what he was doing, especially from a tax perspective, is really almost giving the gifts to her children and grandchildren and her family. Whereas he knew that the son was kind of profligate and was not really was going to need these assets and might blow through them during his lifetime. But he gave the son, he wanted to be fair, and he gave the son the assets so that he could sort of use them up. So it was sort of trying to explain that. But if the father had told the daughter during life, it meant a lot to her. So that's one story. Another story from personally, my parents passed away a couple of years ago, and sometimes we really need to understand the story to understand whether something needs to be kept or disposed of. And when my parents died, my siblings and I had to go through their house, and they had about over 60 years of memorabilia and stuff. And it was, they were kind of pack rats, admittedly. And when we went through that, we knew some things had value, but there was a lot of stuff and memorabilia that they had that we didn't know the context. And we had a dumpster outside their house, and we dumped things into the dumpster. And I think about that especially when I was preparing for this, but just when I talk to clients or others, if you don't know why the item is important, your children or friends or whoever takes care of your estate after you're gone is probably going to get rid of it. And that's really sad, because at least you should collect the story. There's something that I did save from my parents' house. It was a picture that was on my father's wall in his office for my whole life. So probably on the wall of his office for 60 years. And it's a picture that I think Ellen might be able to post it in the chat so you can take a look at it. But it's a picture from when my father was in college. He was probably a sophomore or junior. And he is the person on the left of the picture in a battered top hat, wearing a fake beard with suspenders, which I will tell you, my father was not like that. He never dressed like that. He was not the kind of person who would look like that. But he had that picture on his office wall for 60 some odd years. So I know it was important to him. And so I kept it, but I didn't know why it's important to him. I don't know the story behind it. I was able to actually, after he passed, to talk to his two roommates who happen to be still alive. And they gave me some of the background from their perspective, but I still don't know why it was important to my father. So not knowing some of those things, some of those stories and the meanings means that we don't know what to keep, what to give away, what to throw away. So as we're thinking about all this, I think how do you start this process? And how do you start estate planning? Many of us many people get paralyzed or overwhelmed and they don't start their estate planning until late in life, or maybe, when it's too late. And people will say things like, I'll just leave this to be handled when I'm gone. My children or grandchildren or friends or whoever, they all know what I want, so they'll just divide everything fairly. Some people say, well, I don't want to make a decision because it's going to make somebody mad that I gave this to this person and this to this person. And some people just say, I don't want to dwell on my own death. So there's sort of good reasons, or people come up with good reasons to not make a plan. But I would say it's much better to make a plan than to leave the disposition of your estate to chance. And many of people I know, estate planning attorneys, accountants, insurance people, others who deal with assets for estates, they have stories of families that have been broken apart because the person who died wasn't clear about the disposition, did not have a plan. And there are lawsuits that have dragged on. I mean, every once in a while you see them in the paper that drag on for decades, where beneficiaries argue about these assets. And it's not always the most expensive things, it's just the things that people have the most meaning, things that have the most meaning to people. And they argue about them, and they spend a lot of money, and they spend a lot of court time, and they spend a lot of money on lawyers. So it's really a good idea to start a plan, to have a plan. So how do you start? One thing in terms of passing that legacy and the stories, I've talked to clients over the years about, write a letter, make a recording, do a family history, doing anything to start doing that. But I think a lot of people find even that very daunting because they don't know where to start, or they just feel like they don't have the time. And last week, in the Evening with Artifacts with Jeff Greenwald, that I hope you all will go back and look at, because it was a really interesting discussion. But he had a quote where he said, if you're giving an object away, it motivates you to tell the story, which I thought was a really interesting thing to say, and very apropos for artifacts and talking about things. So maybe an easy way to start this kind of process of handing on legacy, handing on the stories, is to create a list of 3 to 5 things that you value and you want to give away now, or in the future, or at your death, and who you want it to go to, and why you think it's important, and things like that. And Artifacts is a fantastic way to do that. That's one of the reasons that I've gotten involved with Artifacts, and I love hearing what's going on from Heather and Ellen about the company and the tool. There's been so much that has changed, but it's a great way to start organizing your thoughts. If you put something on Artifacts, it is probably something that's important and has meaning and value to you. And once you have the items in Artifacts, you already have a description, you already have the story behind the item, you already have where it came from, when you got it, all those kinds of details. And it's a pretty easy thing to then make that part of an estate plan if you want. I think I've told Heather and Ellen the story that my mother-in-law, who passed away earlier this year, we were visiting her sometime last fall, and we were sort of talking about, she knew that she was not well and was probably not going to live forever. And so we were talking about kind of legacy. I can't remember exactly how we got on this subject, but I mentioned that I had this new tool, Artifacts. And I said, what are the things, we started talking about things in her living room where we were sitting. And there was a table that was sitting right next to me. And so I asked her about it, and she told us the story about her father, who was a salesman, of the gods. He was an amazing salesman, loved to talk to people, loved meeting people. And he was walking down the street one time in Wilmington, Delaware, and he passed an attorney's office, and he looked in the window and he saw this table. It was a butler's table. He said, that's a really neat table. And he walked in and started talking to the people that were there and said, can I buy the table? And he had some conversation with them and, buddy and things like that. And he ended up walking out with the table. And there was the table that was in their house for many, many years, and then was in my in-laws' house for many, many years. And we still have it. So it's kind of, but now we know the story and where it came from. And it was really fun to see my mother-in-law, her face kind of light up in telling the story. And then we went on to look at other things that were in her living room. So it's a simple way to pass along items with meaning in your life. So just some thoughts about maybe ways of starting your estate planning with things to give not just the items, but to begin to think about how to give the stories as well. So I would love to hear what people want to talk about, hear what things people are interested in hearing more about, and any questions that have come up. But those are some of the thoughts that I had about estate planning and things.
That's great. Thank you, Dutch. I think that's a very visionary look at how we deal with all of our stuff in our lives. We have for the past couple of decades heard about the Internet of Things, and to be actually physically surrounded by stuff and then having to decide what do we do with it throughout our lives, not just end of life, but as we move, downsize, relocate, even organize. There's literally a lot of stuff we have to go through. One of the questions we've had come in, could you point our listeners into any good resources you may have to get started, or resources to give them more information about estate planning, and just things to consider?
So, whenever I talk to clients about this, I think the first thing, the easiest thing, the simplest thing, and probably the most productive thing is to get a healthcare directive, there's various names for it, living will, all that. And there's some forms that you can get. You don't have to go to an attorney. Several states have great forms. There's a fantastic form, which is on the state of Maryland website, which I strongly suggest you use because it's very informative. It's really clear. But you can just use that, and having something that, God forbid, if something happens to you, people can make decisions. And so anybody, any adult, any person over the age of 18 should have one of those. So forgetting about even, getting to the estate planning, that's just a good first step. There are some good resources nowadays in terms of, once you get that, the next thing you need is a will. And there are some resources online. There's some internet sites you can go to. I think Quicken has a will maker. There's a thing called US Legal Wills. There's Trust and Will. There's others that are out there, and you can. I have no connection with any of them. I can't suggest one or the other, but there are resources to be able to create a simple will by yourself without going to an attorney. And you do need to follow your states. Some states, you need 2 witnesses. Some states you need 1 witness. Some states you need it to be notarized, blah, 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 blah. But those sites will, most of them will tell you what your state requires. So that is the next step. If you're going to get any more advanced than that, you really need an attorney. And there are some good in the DC area. We have the Washingtonian Magazine and others that will give you lists of attorneys that are sort of well thought of. I am, again, I have no connection to any of this, but I have a huge amount of respect once you need a more advanced estate plan of looking at, there's a ACTEC, which is the American College of Trust and Estates Counsel, ACTEC, ACTEC. And these are really the best estate planning attorneys in the country, and there's a few around the world, but mostly in this country, in the United States, where you can go and you can find one of those attorneys. And if you are under the age of 45, let's say, or something like, younger, you might find that, and that will give you an idea of somebody you could call, but maybe you might want to talk to their associate or a younger attorney. But if if you have significant wealth and you've got a detailed estate plan, you may want to talk to the ACTEC fellow directly. But that's a great place to start. And once you have an attorney, you'll get a will. You may need to have a trust. You might need to have a power of attorney, things like that. There might be more details. They should help coordinate your assets, your retirement assets, which aren't really part of your will. They're not covered by your will, so you need to make sure that that's coordinated. Things like that, and your insurance. They'll make sure that all of that is coordinated, and that's where a really good estate planning attorney will help look at that very holistically and help you think about what we talked about tonight. Things that may not have monetary value, but actually have great personal value. I've talked to a number of estate planning attorneys. You can put some wording into your documents if you want that are sort of not legalese, but they might help describe things, which some people have found to be very helpful. Because if a child or a grandchild or somebody is reading a will, it can be a very boring document. But if you if there's something in there that says, this is why I'm doing it, or this is what made me think about this within the will, it makes the will a little bit more personal. And some estate planning attorneys are comfortable with doing that. So those are some of the ways, long-winded, but that's kind of the gamut.
That's great. Thank you, Dutch. That's super informative. We've got a question that has come in from Judy. She'd like to know, can you briefly discuss simple will versus trust?
So a will is, it really only comes into power at your death. It is a public document, so it would get filed with your probate office wherever you are in DC or Maryland or Texas or California or wherever it is. Wherever you have assets, your will be filed there. If you own assets in multiple states, you might have to file your will in multiple places. And then there's a process for having your executor, who's the person who's appointed to and empowered under your will, to then manage the assets that are covered by your will. So it really, it kind of handles the assets from date of death till everything is distributed. And so that might take 6 months, might take 6 years, might take 60 years, you never know. But it'll last for as long as until everything is distributed and retitled and is out of the estate. But it is a public document, so that's something to think about, especially if you have privacy concerns. You may be concerned about not wanting to have certain assets. Maybe you own part of a family business, or you own some special assets that you don't want everybody to know about. You may not want to have them pass under your will. And a trust is something that can be formed under a will. So it can start with the date of death, but it can also start way before. It can start the day you talk to your attorney. And you can create a trust. A trust is a separate legal entity. It may or may not have its own tax ID. It may or may not have its own sort of life beyond you. It may have, there's various tax consequences to different kinds of trusts, but trusts are very, very, very flexible ways of dealing with assets that are put into the trust, where you're appointing, it's either you or somebody else is appointed the trustee and manages those assets. And they could be managed for hundreds of years. I mean, there are trusts that have been around for a very, very long time. And now there are trusts that are being created in the last sort of 30 or 40 years under laws changed. And now trusts in the United States can last for, hundreds of years. So you can manage those assets for generations of your family or friends. So that's kind of the difference between them. Does that help? Hopefully, Judy.
Hopefully that helps. It was a very, I think, overarching description of the two. Definitely, I think helps us get our heads around the difference between the two and some of the pros and the cons potentially. Another question we've got, Dutch, is, are there any concerns with giving stuff away, or anything people should think about top of mind before they start gifting items to friends or family or loved ones?
I think the major, there's two ways to look at this. One is taxes, and the other is relationships. So from a tax perspective, in 2022, if you give anything that has a monetary value, whether it's cash or an object, over $16,000 to another person, you will have to file a gift tax return. So you need to be aware of what you're giving, and is it below that threshold? If it's below the threshold, you don't have to file anything. You just give the gift away. So you have a China plate that's worth $10,000. You can give that plate to your grandchild, granddaughter, friend, whoever you want to give it to.
Make sure they know the story, right?
What's that? Make sure, yeah, make sure you pass the story. Yeah, exactly. If it's over $16,000, and actually next year it's going to go up to $17,000. But if it's over that amount that's created by the IRS, it's sort of limited by the IRS, then you're going to have to file a gift tax return. So you should be thoughtful about that. And it's not very complicated. It's, you can easily file a gift tax return. You can talk to your accountant or whatever, but you don't want to forget that. And it's, you don't want to get in trouble for that. I think up until now, the IRS has not been very well funded, and they probably haven't followed up on every $20,000 gift, but you don't want to be on the bad side of that. So we don't want to have anybody be the case that comes up with the $20,000 gift that they never filed a gift tax return for. So that's kind of the tax side of it. The relationship side is, I've seen many cases, and I know from friends and colleagues, many cases where an item is given to one person, and it generates bad feeling because another child, let's say they give to one child and they don't give to another child, that there's a perception of inequality and it's unfair. And I think that's where the communication is so important. If you don't talk to your children about, this is why I'm doing it, and yes, I'm giving that special thing to this child because it makes sense to do that, and I will do something to make it up to you in the long run for another child. But that's where the communication, I think, certainly, I feel like my parents' generation was, what is it? Treat your children sort of like mushrooms, just keep them in the dark and feed them on poop. And so people would just not know anything, and then they'd suddenly, a parent would die, and they'd find out that, oh my God, I've now got $20 million, and I don't know I don't know how to deal with it. I don't know how to invest it. I don't know who to trust. I don't know anything. And I think so many people nowadays are much more comfortable of talking about wealth with children or grandchildren or whoever's appropriate, because they know that that's the best way that wealth can be managed for a long period of time, is if people are brought into, given the information early, and they can prepare for it. So that's sort of the two ways I would think about it.
What's the best way to kick off those conversations, Dutch? I suspect they can be really difficult conversations if you're not used to talking about that as a family, or if it's coming, you've 30 years later, you're having this conversation like, I just found out my parents either have these assets or they have these plans. How do you kick that off and make it not, as awkward as it may seem to be?
So it's great question, and a good thing to think about. So my personal opinion, and it's just, I feel more communication personally is better than less communication. With my own daughter, so we started when she was a teenager. She had an allowance, and we helped her understand how to deal with that. We helped her plan for things. When she got to be 18, she got an account that had funds in it from that we'd given her and grandparents had given her and things like that over many years. And we talked about that. And it was not a huge account, but we could talk about the investment of that account and the management of the account and the budgeting, how using that account would work for her budget, and talk about, well, if you use it now, if you use that $1,000 now, it's gone. But if you save that $1,000, then in 10 years, this is how much you're going to have. It sort of helps children begin to understand how to deal with assets and how to deal with wealth. And then, as she's now out and working on her own, talking with her about retirement, talking with her about insurance, talking with her about those things. So bringing her into that conversation and not being afraid to have that conversation with her with real assets. I've had a number of clients that have hadn't started this very early, and I've said, why don't you just give them X amount of money in a brokerage account so you can talk to them about something that's real? Because if you sort of talk about, go take an economics class or go and read the New York Times and and get back to me when you're 50, that's not going to work. So making it real to kids is great. And then as you see that moving along and as you see that they're responsible, you can bring them into more and more conversations, so that eventually my daughter, we're certainly going to, when we meet and talk to our lawyers or whoever, I would want to have her in those meetings so she hears it and she can hear what's going on. It's pretty easy for me because we just have one child. So it makes it a lot harder when you have many more kids. But I think it's starting the conversation so that they learn about their own assets and wealth and investments and things like that, and can grow with that. And then as they grow and get more and show responsibility with that, then you have the opportunity to bring them more into your conversation. And you may never reveal everything to them, which is fine. But at least you're bringing them into some of the conversations that you might have, and appropriate conversations you might have. And that gives them a chance to really show responsibility. The attack of the dog.
That advice really rings true, Dutch. It's
Yeah.
something that I think my father did a really good job when we were being brought up, was having those very transparent conversations very early on. And I definitely appreciate it. And now even with my own daughter, we have those conversations, and it's much smaller scale, but hopefully over time it will grow and just be a natural part of how we go back and forth.
Yeah.
We do have two, I think, great questions from our audience. Let's take the first one. Jessica would like to know, what are tax consequences for gifting a home to a child before parent's death via transferring deed to the child?
So I am not acting as anybody's attorney, and I am not acting as anybody's tax professional. So yeah, good idea. Good. Before you do anything like this, it's a good idea to go and talk to an attorney and make sure you know what you're doing. The tax consequences of gifting a home is the same thing as if you give them, gifting a $500,000 home or $500,000 of stocks or a $500,000 painting. It doesn't really matter. That's still a taxable gift. So under the code, you're not going to pay any tax until you use up what's called your lifetime exemption, which it's right now, I think it's around $12 million. It's scheduled to go back to something around $6 million. But if you don't have an estate that's more than that, you can gift things during your life, and you're not going to pay any gift tax, because sort of you'll use up that estate tax exemption during your life with your gifts, and then when you die, if you have unused exemption, you can still use it. So that's great. But I think the thing that concerns me about when people say I'll give my house to my child or somebody in the family, is that it's no longer your house then. I mean, it's if you if that's the place where you live and somebody else owns it, if they decide to tear it down, they can tear it down. I mean, so you have to be really comfortable gifting something away like that you are really passing title. They can do whatever the heck they want with it, which you may feel comfortable, you may not feel comfortable. And so it's just something to be aware of and make sure that you've thought through the whole thing before you just blithely transfer deed to a child. It may not make a lot of sense. Real estate, it goes down in value. So God forbid let's say you had a $12 million house today, and you gifted it to your child, you used up all your lifetime exemption, and hurricane hits, and now that house is worth $6 million. Well, you used up your exemption, you used it up when the house was worth $12 million. The fact that it's now worth $6 million, you've used up your $12 million, it's all gone. So gifting away things too early can sometimes have you can use up, it can be artwork. I mean, 30 years ago, brown furniture, antique furniture was actually worth something. And, nobody wants brown furniture anymore. So the value of brown furniture has gone way down. That's not a good piece of brown furniture, but it's a piece of brown furniture. So gifting that, when that has a high value, you've used up some of your exemption that maybe if you'd waited until your death, it might not have had as much value. So you just have to be aware of those kinds of things. That's where talking to a good an estate planning attorney can help you sort of think through the pros and cons of gifting a house. So some thoughts.
That's definitely a lot to think about there on that one.
We've got another question from Jill. She would like to know, or she starts off by saying, I sometimes do research to find heirs for people who die without wills. Surprisingly often, the winner can be a complete stranger to the deceased. All the friends, neighbors, and helpers who may have contributed greatly to the person's well-being are totally ignored. Do you find people are resistant to thinking about leaving gifts to people who aren't their blood relatives?
So everybody's opinions on who should benefit from their death is their own opinion. And the great thing about it is if you have a plan, you can make that happen. The only reason why those things happen is the winner is if there's no will or there's not a trust. So under state law, every state has intestacy law. It means you died without a will, a valid will. And that's where making sure that you've signed your will in the proper way for your estate. You have the right numbers of witnesses and the right notaries and the right everything you need. If you die without a will, then by and large, I mean, every state again is a little bit different, but by and large, your estate will go to your immediate family, your siblings, and your parents. If those people are all gone, it starts going to people further and further related to you, but it's not, as Jill pointed out, it's not going to go to your friend, your charity, anything that you want to give to. So that's where having a plan and putting that plan into effect through a will, through the proper estate planning documents is really important. I've talked to so many people who are so generous with charities. And if you die without a will, that charity will get nothing because they are never going to be related to you. And so, if you have that charitable intent or you have a friend that you really want to have benefit, there were some horrible stories before we had gay marriage where, people would be partners for 30 years and they died and their relationship was not recognized. And all the assets from that person went back to the family who may not have talked to that person for 30 years and may have thrown them out of the house and things like that. There were horrible stories. So have a plan, make the right documents, do the right thing. I know it's a pain in the neck, and but it's not that expensive usually to do a simple estate plan. Obviously, if you have a lot of wealth, then you're going to pay more because it's going to be more complicated. But wouldn't you rather have the people you want to receive the assets? I mean, I would. So
Hi, Dutch, quick question for you. One that I get a lot, especially I've been meeting with some folks with DAR and other organizations, a lot of family heirlooms.
Yeah.
We're talking, some of them are sizable, like bassinets, and like they take up space and and there is this big fear factor of, I can will them to somebody, but I don't know that they'll take care of them.
Right.
And there is this hesitation, as you've been discussing, about talking about these things. And I'm wondering, have you had a lot of experience with people who have these kind of even maybe historically relevant objects, and maybe there is a museum, maybe there is a foundation or something like that? And do you have advice for people when they're trying to think through their estate and they're like, I have a lot of this kind of stuff, and I'm worried that they won't take care of it appropriately, or it'll end up in a dumpster, as you said earlier?
Yeah, I think that's where that communication factor is so important, because there are people who say, "Oh my God, we've had this piece of furniture in our house for 50 years, and I'm going to give it to this person because I know they really they'll really like it." But they didn't talk to them beforehand, and that person might be downsizing themselves. They might be living in an apartment. They might not have any interest in holding on to it. So talking to people ahead of time with big items like that, it's much easier with little tchotchkes that you have and a bracelet or a something like that. But if it's a big item, checking with the person to make sure that they actually want it is probably the first step. Artifacting is a great thing to do, because you can at least collect the story and keep the story and pass the story to multiple people. So you're not just giving it to one person anymore. You're giving that story and some pictures and description and all the stuff that's behind that item to multiple people. And you may decide, okay, this is something that nobody's going to want after I'm gone. It's just too big. It's a big armoire, or it's a big this, or it's a big that. And nobody's going to want it. Well, it gives you the opportunity of saying, let's collect all the story we can, and then if I can sell it, I can give it away, I can find the proper home for it. My parents actually had this we had some portraits that were in our house for many years, of ancestors of ours from the 1700s. And there were two huge paintings, sort of 4.5 feet by 3.5 feet, something like that. I mean, they were big portraits, two portraits, one of the husband, one of the wife. And my father, figured out that none of his children could have that. We had walls built in houses when we were moving places, because my parents wanted to keep them, and they had to find a place to have the wall to put them on. So they built walls for them, but they knew that we couldn't have them. So one of the things that my father did, which was great, was that he had very high quality. You can nowadays get very high quality prints of paintings, and he got them and shrunk them down to, I'm looking at them right now, they're about 18 inches by roughly 18 inches by 18 inches. And he was able to donate the originals to a museum, where the museum, he talked to various museums to find out which museum would really like them, would really value them, would conserve them, would do all the things that needed to happen to them, and he gave them to the museum. So that was a great thing to do. So you can do that with items, and that can have a great benefit, because then those portraits are going to be in proper care at a museum for hundreds of years, and they'll be a great benefit, because he was governor of South Carolina, North Carolina, colonial governor of South Carolina, I think he was. Anyways, and he was a Revolutionary War general, and all. But now, I mean, somebody can go look at those portraits and see them, which is great. So, and we still have copies, which look perfectly nice, as long as you don't look at them too close and see that they don't have the brush strokes.
Well, and at Artifacts, we're starting to work with the Society of American Archivists, and they have a lot of literature available for free, a lot of their journal articles, all of this, but a lot of tips and advice that we're also going to reference next week when we roll into Family History Month. But a question came in about this too. Have you had a lot of experience of like helping find people to advise on donating into museums and other places, because there are policies and yes, they will actually preserve it and keep it in climate controlled environments, but there's a cost to bring these in and to maintain them, and they're very selective, right? And it might be documents, it might be photos, it might not be something that's on the wall, but they might be interested, and they do have a lot of that on their website as well.
Yeah, it's a great thing to I think they're talking to appraisers, auction houses, and museums are three of the groups that can really help you think through options for where a particular piece of art or decorative arts or whatever it is might go, and where you'll feel the best about giving it. I think there's a lot of, we all know the stories of the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the Smithsonian, all these things. They have, I don't know, 100,000 or something, some huge astronomical number of paintings that are sitting in their vaults and nobody gets to see. That might be, one person might say, that's great, they'll be in the vault, nobody will see it, but I know it's protected, that's great. Another person might say, well, I want to sell it because then at least somebody's going to get to see it and enjoy it. And I'll get the money from it, which will be nice, but really I want to have it out in the world where people can see it. So there's no wrong answer, but helping, talking to a couple different people who look at it from different angles, like an appraiser, insurance professionals sometimes have ideas, auction houses sometimes have ideas, and then talking to museums that actually collect that particular kind of art can give you sort of different perspectives on it and help you come up with what you think is going to be the right answer for you. And it's your item, so you get to choose. So.
Yeah, and Dutch, this has definitely started, I think, a whirlwind in chat. People are going back and forth with just the things you have to be aware of, how much time it may take up to a year. It could take several documents. It could take an entire process, not as simple as simply saying, here's the object, dear museum, please take care of it now. So there is a lengthy process.
Yeah.
Another one of our listeners also noted that a great way to document the story, the donation is also part of the story. So if you are using artifacts to document that story of the object, if you decide after being in your family for years, you're going to donate it to a museum or historical society, that's then part of the story. It's a whole next kind of what happens to it next piece of the story.
Yeah.
There's
referencing back to a thing that we talked about before was, gifting your house. It's kind of the same thing as gifting. If you want to gift a gift to the art museum, or you want to gift your house, something I didn't mention before is once you gift the house to your children, it means they're also responsible for the taxes and the upkeep and all that sort of stuff. And in kind of the same way, if you give a painting to a museum, because so many of these museums have such huge collections, gathering dust in their basements, they sort of are saying, well, we'll take the item, but we need X amount of a monetary gift to pay for all this upkeep. And so that's something to think about when you make those decisions.
That's very true. We've also got a couple of questions floating around about knowing the value of something before you decide to donate it or to pass it on to family or friends, since you mentioned the $16,000 estate gift tax per year. We, of course, at Artifacts, we have the what's it worth button, so you can very easily find out the value, free valuation from our partner Heritage Auctions. But aside from that, how do you find out the value so you know when you're making those decisions?
Yeah, it's really, I think most people, if they have an object in their house, they have a rough idea that it's not worth that much. There are always stories of, I found something up in the attic and it was a Picasso or whatever. But realistically, most of the things that people have in their houses, they kind of know, they have a sense about the value of it. And again, I am not representing anybody, and I am not a tax person, and I'm not representing this in any way. But if you, in good faith, you think it's probably worth, $100 or $500 or whatever, and you gift it to your grandchild, and they end up selling it 30 years from now, and it's a Picasso. I don't think the IRS is going to come back and beat you over the head. I hate to say that. I don't know if that's true, but it's something that you weren't out to defraud anybody. You thought it was just a scrawl on a napkin, and it ended up it was Picasso who was scrawled on the napkin. But if you think it's worth $10,000, then it's worth getting some kind of valuation for it. And there are a number of ways. You mentioned artifacts, which as Ellen and Heather know, I used. My grandmother had some bowls that she brought back or got from China. And it's actually part of a whole set, which I didn't know about. I found out that my cousin has the rest of the set, and I just have these 2 huge bowls. And I was able to use artifacts to find out whether it was worth anything. And realistically, it's not worth that much, but they're really nice bowls. And great story behind them and all that sort of stuff. But there are some online sites now, appraisal sites, that at least can give you an idea. If you really have no idea what something's worth, they'll either say, you got to bring it in, we got to see it, we got to touch it. Or they might be able to say it's worth about this, and you can get some comfort with that. If it is something that you think actually has some value, you need to get it appraised. I know it's a pain in the neck, but to do the right thing and to make sure that you're protected and nobody's going to come after you for taxes, back taxes, or anything like that, you need to get it appraised. And recognize that that's also something you're going to want to do for insurance purposes. So if you put something on Artifacts and Heritage comes back and says it's worth $30,000. You probably want to think about talking to your insurance person and getting them to think about insuring it for an appropriate amount.
Mm-hmm.
So those are all things to think about when you're but
no, that all makes sense. That
yeah, I mean, you probably have a sense. The child's drawing, your child's drawing you put on Artifacts. It's probably, even though your child is a wonderful child, probably not worth more than $16,000.
You mean she's not the next Van Gogh?
Probably not, unless you never know. It might be eventually worth that, but at least today, it's not worth that. So.
Well, Judy makes a great point that you may need to get a paid appraisal to make a tax deduction if given to a museum or other institution. And then we also have a question too. Could you briefly touch on the difference between valuation and appraisal and how that comes into the estate planning realm?
So I'm not sure that there is maybe the person who made the question would see what but I don't think there's valuation and appraisal. So when you're giving somebody a stock or a bond or whatever, you need to know what you're passing along, whether it's you're making a gift now or it's part of your estate. And under IRS rules, things that have a public value, like stocks and bonds and things like that, you can go out to the markets and you can say, okay, on the date of death or the date of the gift, it was worth X. And that's fairly easy. You don't have to do much in the way of getting additional valuation, additional appraisal. If it is something that is not publicly marketable like that, and even some, you can have private stock and things like that may not, you may not know what the value is, but you need to get a valuation before you can pass it along. And that is, the IRS has very clear rules on what a proper appraisal is. It's not just getting your brother Jim Bob to come down and say, yeah, I think that painting is worth about $5. You have to be an appraiser who has the right qualifications for that object. If it's a painting, it's a painting appraiser. If it's a sculpture, it's a sculpture appraisal. It's a 18th century piece of furniture. It's whatever that is, they have to have a certain amount of expertise in that area to be able to give a valid appraisal. And then when you're making a gift, and as people pointed out, to take a charitable deduction, or in an estate to value it, you attach that appraisal to the documentation, and then the IRS can come back and say we don't agree with it. I mean, there's lots of IRS cases of people who they gave a gift to charity and they said it was worth $1 million, and the IRS says, well, it's worth actually $500,000. Or I gave a gift and it was only worth $20,000 to my child, so that's great. No, it's actually worth $1 million. You should have done a little bit more work on that, and you should have gotten a better appraisal. So that's the cases where the IRS will commonly question hard to value assets of all kinds. Certainly family businesses, things like that, are and real estate. Those are all things that the IRS can come back and question, whether it's a charitable gift or a gift to a child or a gift in the estate.
Mhm. Great. We've got time for one more question, and Jill has popped one into chat. She notes that stories and provenance often enhance the value of objects. Knowing that you're not an attorney and offer no.
I'm not acting as an attorney. I play one on TV. No.
Do you think an executor might be liable for not getting full value for the assets if they fail to look at the stories or other details on artifacts?
It's a good question. I think it's something that it goes to the appraisal factor of the asset in an estate. If the executor goes to an appraiser and says, appraise this item, and part of the appraisal process is the appraiser will say where did it come from, what's the story, what's the background. If you hid that or didn't help them find that story, then I think as an executor you might have trouble. But realistically, you're going to want to do the right thing. You as an executor or whoever's doing that valuation, if you're giving the gift to charity, you'll want to make sure you provide all the information you have about that. Nobody's asking any particular executor or trustee or whatever to become a PhD in art history to look at this stuff. So there's elements of good faith, and I think you're trying to find sort of a happy medium. But that's where a good appraiser under the IRS code, I mean, they are people who are expert at this, and they'll ask all the right questions, and they'll find out all the stuff that might enhance or detract from the value.
Great. Thank you so much, Dutch. This has been a very thought-provoking and very informative session. We really thank you for your time this evening, and thank you all to our audience members for joining us. We will be releasing the recording tomorrow on our YouTube channel, and Dutch will also be publishing an article detailing all that he discussed tonight, as well as further sharing his vision for the estate planning of things later this week. So make sure everyone who's attended gets the link to the article. And as always, if you have any further questions, feel free to reach out to us at hello@artifacts.com. Thank you again for joining us tonight. We look forward to seeing you next week when we dive into the world of preservation with our partner monitor. Oh, no, I got the schedule wrong.
That's okay. Next week, we're bringing in Rodney Versiel, who is a National Geographic Award-winning photographer, and he will be a lot of fun, I promise.
I was ahead of myself.
It's all right.
Great. Thank you all for joining us. We appreciate it, and have a good night.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.